This video was made in association with KnifeInformer.com. Head on over to Knife Informer for all of your blade-related needs, including reviews, comparisons, stats, and more. What is up, everybody, and welcome. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this Kruger K1. This knife is a custom order that I ordered a few months ago. I took delivery of it at New York Custom Knife Show, and I've had it on hand for about 6 or 7 weeks now, so I've had plenty of time to carry it and use it and enjoy it. So I'm really excited to be able to share this knife with you guys today. And before we go ahead and jump into the features and flaws, let's take a look at the stats, starting with the overall length. Now, this knife is going to be a fairly reasonable everyday carry size. We are looking at just about 7.5 inches of overall length, so completely reasonable size there. You know, not super small, necessarily like the A6 Mini, which is even smaller in scale, as you can see. But again, it's not huge like an 8.5 inch knife, where it might freak somebody out necessarily. So let's go ahead and look at a size comparison next to a couple more common knives, starting with the PM2 and also including the Rat 2. And you can see here, it kind of falls somewhere right in the middle. Now, I did do a video of the K4, which is Keith's other model, and you guys can go check that out. It had very similar dimensions to the K1. So there's not a lot of variance in terms of, I know lots of makers, they might start with a certain size knife and then offer a smaller version, or they might just do the same model with a big and little. We're seeing that a lot with a lot of companies lately, actually. But this knife ultimately is fairly similarly sized to the K4. They just have different sort of design aesthetics, but they're about the same size. And you can see here it's a little bit bigger than a Rat 2, which honestly I like, in the sense that it's a little bit more comfortable in the hand, especially in terms of saber grip. Being just that little bit bigger. I've always really enjoyed the Rat 2. It's a great small little knife. I've convinced other people that I know to buy Rat 2s, like non-knife people, that is, as their like main EDC. It's definitely a knife that I really like, but it just can be a little bit small, especially I have somewhat chubbier fingers, and so the K1 is a nice step up in terms of size. You can see it really just fits well in the hand, provides good, useful blade shape. So yeah, as far as size comparison, I think it's a great little EDC size. You can see it's pretty much dwarfed by the PM2, and it's a good overall size. So let's really quickly check out the weight on this knife, and then we can go ahead and jump into the fun stuff. Okay, so we get this lined up here. It is going to be 3.28 ounces. So as you guys can imagine, fairly lightweight knife. We are looking at carbon fiber scales that have been fully contoured to the edge. So they've been very thinned out, as you can see. The edge is rounded all the way from the get-go. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of showing that off, but so fairly thin. The liners aren't, crazy thin, but again, we do have these relatively ultra thin scales as far as I'm concerned, and they are carbon fiber. We do have a G10 backspacer, so ultimately we're looking at a fairly light package. The other thing to note, and this is something I'll bring up later, is that there's a fairly thin blade stock on this knife. If you actually compare the blade stock to that of my A6 Mini, which is a much smaller knife, you can see that the blade stock on the K1 is actually thinner. So ultimately, those are the ways in which Keith was able to achieve a 3.28 ounce carry weight on a 7.5 inch knife. So that's definitely awesome. Let's go ahead and jump into the features and flaws and give you guys a better idea of what we're looking at. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to give you guys kind of like a general overview of what's on the knife, and then I'm going to tell you about a couple neat things that Keith did to make it a little bit more special than it might appear to be at first glance. So I'm just cleaning up the blade here a little bit for you so I can show you guys that hand rub satin finish. I do actually use this knife fairly frequently. It's one of the few customs that I reach for tasks, that aren't necessarily super light. Stuff that I would normally reach for my Umnums on or my Ultratech. I also reach for my K1, and that's because it's just a bit more of a user build. There's no bolster or anything, and I plan on continuing to buy Keith's knives, so I don't really have any particular interest in like selling this knife, because I did custom order it for a specific reason, and B, I plan on buying like fancier Krugers, something with a bolster or whatever. So this is very much going to be my user. So this knife's already relatively scratched up and covered in gunk and stuff. It gets used. But yeah, so let's go ahead and jump in here. First, I'll give you guys a quick glimpse of this blade, and we'll of course look at the details of the blade later. But just to give you an idea of these mirrored flats, these high polish flats, and this beautiful hand rub. Oh, just stabbed my thumb. This beautiful hand rub satin finish. Now, on my K4, I had mentioned to Keith that the satin finish didn't look quite as clean as it does on a Thorburn, and he told me he would take care of that on this one for me, and he did. The hand rub satin finish is absolutely gorgeous. Stunning in every way. So really good job there on the blade. Then you can see here for the scales, we are looking at the electric lightning strike carbon fiber, or electric silver strike. What this is the blue and silver sort of squiggles that you see. Those are actually mylar, which is that really shiny material you see certain helium balloons being made out of. And then throughout the weave, we also have silver wire, just as you would have on regular silver strike carbon fiber. And this, of course, matches the carbon fiber on my Thorburn L36M. So, again, you guys can see very contoured. Just a beautiful job. No real voids or anything. Finished pretty well. And then if we take a look at the lock side, you can see a 3D milled titanium clip with a ceramic ball. This has been anodized purple. We'll also talk about this later. And then we are looking at some anodized liners in a low voltage purple. So you can see here, if I start to wipe these down, a lot of that bronze will get cleaned up. A lot of that comes from hand oils and heat. And then we get a nice deep sort of purple color all through the liners. Okay, so that's the general overview in terms of aesthetics, but there are two interesting points that I want to talk to you guys about, and these were made aware to me while I was at New York Custom Knife Show taking the knife from Keith. So he said, there's two things that I did on the knife, and I want to see if you can figure out what they are. So I took a look at the knife, and I studied it very closely, and I said, I open up the knife and I look in, and I see this little dot inside the G10. See if you guys can see that without the flashlight yet. Maybe, maybe not. So I see this little dot in the G10, and I said, is that moon glow? And he said, yeah, it is. And he said, but it's not green, it's blue, which appears to be sort of like a newer version of moon glow that is offered. But I actually have my flashlight here. Crank it up real quick, and I'll show you guys real fast what this looks like. But it's super sweet. So he hid this little piece of moon glow in the backspacer for me, and we'll see if you can just barely see it. I have all these lights in the room, so it's tough to see, but it gets super, super bright. It's actually like, if you do it at nighttime, it's really cool, or in a dark room. because it's really bright, and you can actually close the knife and the light kind of bounces and reflects off of the hollow grind and up through the liners, and it kind of creates like a little light display. It's actually pretty neat. So that was something that he hid. And then the other thing was something that I was actually unable to discern. He had to just tell me. I essentially gave up on being able to figure it out. So let's see if I can show you guys. This is a very difficult detail to notice, but I think I can point it out well enough. So we'll have this Thorburn handy so that I can show you sort of what it looks like otherwise. And I'm going to stand up here. It might sound like I'm a little far away, but I really want to make sure I'm showing you guys properly what I'm talking about. So if you look at the knife, from about here to here, the carbon fiber is sort of normally spaced, is evenly spaced. And when I say the carbon fiber, I mean the weave itself. And then you can see as you get closer to the edge, the weave starts to get really tight. You see that? So big chunk here, next to another big chunk, that's the really thick weave through the center. But then here it gets kind of scrunched up. You can start to see these lighter gray lines become much closer to one another. And so he's actually done this all the way around the scale. And if you look closely, and if I rotate it in the light properly, you'll start to see like a really clear, defined pattern. So you can see right here, travels all the way down, curves right around the screw, and continues all the way up through here and around the pivot. So he's basically modified the weave of the carbon fiber around the edge to give a consistent sort of aesthetic property to the knife that's very different. So if we take a look at this Thorburn where the carbon fiber is evenly spaced all the way along the side, you might be able to tell the difference. See how the Thorburn stays kind of as a thick weave all the way around? So what he did was he took, what was an otherwise not very dressy configuration, no bolster or anything, just carbon fiber scales, and he spiced it up in a way that really makes the knife super, super unique. And again, it was such a subtle thing that I couldn't even tell, just by looking at the knife. But once it was pointed out to me, it became incredibly obvious. And now I can't look at the knife without seeing it. It's very plain obvious to me what's going on here. And I actually asked him to share with me the method by which he used to succeed at this, and he was like, I can't tell you that. So that's obviously something that, I don't know if it's like a trade secret for him specifically or for that little group of South Africans, that all kind of work together. I don't know. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if it was just a matter of actually scrunching up the weave or how you do that. I mean, I'm pretty sure once the sort of billet or plate of carbon fiber is complete, that the epoxy or whatever's used to hold it all together is sort of soaked through the whole thing. So I don't really know that. I mean, I'm just assuming. I don't know what I'm talking about, but I don't really know how he achieved that. So that was like a really interesting, cool thing. So I've spent too much time on going over the aesthetics of the knife. Let's go ahead and jump into the rest of the features and flaws, starting with the ergonomics. Now, while the knife is on the narrow side, the heavily contoured scales provide a really comfortable, rounded feel. The flipper tab does provide some slipping protection, though it's not super comfortable to be pressed up against regularly. It's not sharp per se, but it's just kind of curved downward a little bit, so you don't want to be like ramming your index finger into it. It's not quite that comfy, but it's gonna work perfectly fine. The jimping here appears to be lifted directly from Thorburn, if we're being honest. But that's something that I'm completely comfortable with because I think that Thorburn jimping's excellent. It both looks classy and then is also really useful, especially when you bear down on it. It can become very grippy, very sharp in a good way. So definitely appreciate that. And then, while the knife has sort of a generic saber grip because it's just sort of a pill shape. It must be said that it does also have a really good pinch grip as well. There aren't any nice contours for your middle finger to fall into like I've talked about on some other knives, but ultimately your index finger is going to push into this jimping very well and provide a lot of purchase. And it's just it's a shape of a knife, right? It's nothing crazy here. So you guys can imagine pretty good slicing motion in pinch grip. So ultimately, pretty good ergonomics. The edges are all smoothed out. There's nothing super sharp or pointy. There's no real hot spots other than, again, pushing into this flipper tab a little bit, which, I mean, you're probably not going to be pushing this through anything really that dense anytime soon, I don't imagine. So moving on, the clip is kind of an interesting piece of this knife. Now, I could be mistaken, so please take this with a grain of salt, but I'm fairly certain that this is the only K1 in the world with a 3D milled clip. This was a special request that I had in the build because the K1s typically, every single K1 I've ever seen has come with a pressed clip. And that was keeping me from wanting to buy the K1 model, especially with the K4 already having the milled clip and me having already owned a K4. So I requested that we put one of the K4 clips on the K1, and Keith obliged, and here we are. So I'm definitely a big fan of having this clip. You guys have heard me on the channel talk before about these 3D milled clips with the ceramic ball. Lots of South African makers use them. They're fairly common. I really like them because they come out of the pocket really well, and they make a nice snappy sound. So there's like really great acoustics to removing the knife from your pocket, which I definitely appreciate. And they're always super easy to get back in the pocket with just one hand. And so they're some of my favorite clips on the market. So I'm definitely very happy with this clip thus far. The next aspect of the knife to discuss is the ever important action. And as we've discussed on some previous videos, this is going to be broken into two different sections: deployment and closing. Now, as far as deployment is concerned, it's one of Keith's stronger suits on all the knives of his that I've tried. And again, that's my personal K4 that I bought, this K1, and about 5 other K4s that I tried at New York Custom Knife Show. So I've handled, about a half dozen of his knives. And deployment is always a really, really strong suit for him. It's really snappy, it's really clean, really consistent. I like it a lot. The volume of the lockup is a little meager compared to a Thorburn. We talk about the Thorburn thwack, and this is something where Herukis Blumeris and J.D. Vandeventer have sort of been catching up in the acoustics department. It's definitely something that's important on a knife. That's an area where Keith, has a little bit of work to be done. It's not the most attention-grabbing sound when it locks up, but it is authoritative in terms of the actual deployment itself. And it might be unfair to say that the acoustics are off. It's more. It is a fairly loud knife. It's more that I can hear a little bit of vibration coming through the scales, which is something on I don't want to say more solid builds, but there are crisper sounds that you can get from a knife. And so the deployment on this isn't quite as crisp because you hear a little bit of that reverberation through the liners. But it is very authoritative, very snappy, very clean. And I enjoy the deployment on his knives a lot. Now, having said that, we are going to move on to the closing section. This is still an area that I'd like to see improvement on from Keith. Some K4s that I've seen are slightly more free-dropping than this K1. It's possible that Keith is just building these like this on purpose. Not everybody likes a free blade, but I do. This one definitely requires a shake to get closed. You can see that if we just let gravity do the work, doesn't really go anywhere. You can see really slight minor motions get the blade to move, really, really light wiggles, and it slowly comes to a close. Now, of course, a really sort of like a medium shake gets a full close every time, as you can see here. So it really does not take a hard shake. You don't have to whip it. A light shake will bring the knife to a close, but it isn't quite as free as some of the other knives. from the same area. Now, again, I had mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about the thickness of the blade stock. If you look at my A6 Mini from A Squared Knives, it's slightly more free dropping than the K4. Sorry, the K1. Ever so slightly. But it also has a thicker blade stock. So it's just one of those things to consider. There's a lot that goes on with a knife, and that kind of determines what makes an action a certain way. And so just bear in mind that and again, the knife is so smooth, guys. I struggle when I make these videos because, we're talking about basically everything that comes across this table is super high caliber, right? And so to say that something is bad compared to something else or something's worse than something else, it really doesn't do the knives justice, because it makes it sound like there's these huge gaps when really all we're talking about is like 1 or 2 percentiles of difference, right? Like, this knife is incredibly smooth. It's got an amazing action on it, and yet I can still compare it to some other makers who have had a little bit more, or a lot more in some cases, time making knives, and they make these 5 percentile sort of increases in perfection, and it's really noticeable to a collector, but it makes it scary for me because I know that people who watch the channel and watch lots of videos, kind of understand where I'm coming from, and they understand that these differences are very subtle. But I always get nervous, especially when I'm talking about a younger maker, that somebody's going to come and watch just this video and then say, oh, well, I'm never going to buy a Keith Kruger because, it's a lot worse than this, and this. Like, I'm petrified of that happening because, that's so not the case. Like, this knife is absolutely incredible, and is more than worth the asking price on these. But I do have to be, as objective as I can and just say that it is not quite as free dropping as some other knives that I've tried, but it's definitely up there. So moving on, the blade is going to be N690 steel. Keith prefers N690 over M390 because the harder steel is more likely to chip. You can, fix a rolled edge on N690 steel, but a chip could be permanent. And that was sort of his take on the difference between the two steels. I don't really care. The only thing that I worry about with steel is corrosion resistance, and both N690 and M390 have been two of the best steels that I've dealt with thus far in terms of corrosion. So I'm perfectly comfortable with all of that and those decisions. But that is the blade steel. And then, of course, in terms of the blade shape, we have that kind of traditional South African shape. We have a general drop point with a curved swedge, a hollow grind, and a hollow ground swedge. We have a mirror or near mirror polished flats, along with a horizontal hand rub satin finish along the primary bevels. And, a lot of people complain that these blade shapes from these makers, they all look the same. A, I disagree, but B, it's fine for there to be some similarities when it's for good reason. These knives all make really excellent slicers. They're all very beautiful. They all hide wear fairly well for use and beauty to kind of be maintained at the same time. And so I'm really happy with these blades. And so that's pretty much going to do it in terms of the review for this one, guys. I do have a story time on this knife. It's been a while since I've had a story time. So if you only came here to just see the review and you got all the information you need, you can feel free to jump off now. But for anybody interested in learning a little bit more about Keith and my experience taking delivery of this knife, then you can go ahead and stick around for story time. All right, guys. So as far as story time goes, I met Keith at New York Custom Knife Show this year, and I spent a fair amount of time with him. He's a really great dude. I will be pushing him for a sort of dressier knife on order sometime in 2018, most likely. But yeah, I got to have a really good time. So he was the first person really that I met up with at the show. When I was headed into the show on the first day, he was messaging me. I know that he was really excited to give me the knife, which I guess actually, before I really tell the story of the show, we'll go back to how I ended up ordering this knife, because I actually own this knife sort of by accident. So, I bought the K4 from Blade Gallery a while back, and, there's a video on that knife and everything. And I really like that knife. It ended up being owned by a close friend of mine and neighbor. So, I still got to hang out with the knife because he won it in my raffle. And then I think I ended up winning the knife back and then selling it again. So that kind of came in and out of my ownership a few times. But the K4 was super sweet. And because I liked the K4, I wanted a K1 as well. I was interested in having or trying, sort of both of his models. And so I think I made a comment on an Instagram post. Blade Gallery must have posted a K1 that they had or something like that. Or maybe Keith posted. I'm not sure. I commented somewhere sort of innocently on Instagram, just saying, oh man, I'd be really interested in getting a K1. Just none of these configurations have really excited me. And I got a message from Blade Gallery, a private message from them, maybe an hour later, and it was like, hey, do you want a K1? And I was like, yes. And they were like, we can get that for you. And I was like, okay. And they were like, yeah, well, we can give you a slot on Keith's books for New York Custom Knife Show. And I was already planning on going to New York Custom Knife Show, so I was like, well, that sounds like a pretty great idea. How's that going to work? And basically within 30 minutes, I had sort of hashed out the configuration, and they had already reached out to Keith, and then Keith reached out to me directly. And then so I worked out some of the details with Keith directly over Instagram. And in kind of a swift moment, I just suddenly ended up on his books with a custom order in the works. And so I started getting progress pics from him a couple weeks later, and I was very excited. So when I got to the show, I was standing in line waiting to be let in. The show opened at like 11 or at noon or whatever, and I got there maybe 30 minutes early, so I was towards the back of the line. Some people had waited a long time. Keith was obviously there early as a maker, and he came out and found me, and he was like, hey, do you want to see the knife? And I was like, man, like I'm in line. Just give me a minute, I really want to see it. So he was very excited to show me the knife. By the time I got in the show, I met up with him. He gave me the knife, and we talked a little bit about it. As I mentioned during the main video, he showed me he had me look for the moon glow and the crazy carbon fiber that he did. And so it was really nice hanging out with him. And then if anybody saw the New York Custom Knife Show vlog, I actually ended up going out to dinner with Keith and 5 other South African makers, which was unfreaking believable. Keith gave me some feedback on the channel. We talked about knives in South Africa and all kinds of stuff. It was just a real blast. And so big thanks to Keith for being the person who invited me to that dinner and for making room for me. That was really, really nice. So yeah, he's a really great dude. He dropped off some K4s at New York Custom Knife Show as well. 3 of which, maybe just 2 of which, I sort of helped sell to a couple of friends. So I know those went through African Custom Knives. So that's really great. It's really nice to see his knives getting out in the world. I know that a few Redditors and Instagrammers own his knives now. And, hopefully I had something to do with influencing that. I'm really excited about that. And, for any of you who don't know, I guess I kind of talked to you assuming a few things, but Keith obviously is the son-in-law to Andre Thorburn, and that is where a lot of his skills and learnings come from. So very, very cool. We should definitely expect to see really neat things from Keith in the future. He's sticking to mostly sort of low budget configurations right now. Carbon fibers, G10s, stuff like that, and not too much of he's got some stainless steel and titanium stippled bolsters out there, but they're harder to find, and I don't think he makes those quite as frequently. And I talked to him about that. It's because, he wants to be able to keep his knives reasonable, and they still are between $500 and $650. They're completely reasonably priced, these knives. They're full custom knives. And he really wants to be able to keep those reasonable. But now that I've owned 2 non-dress configurations of each of his models, and the fact that I have a little bit more of a connection with him now, I think sometime in 2018, if I can scrounge up the funds, I will push him for sort of a dress build, something with a bolster, something that I can be a little bit more, I don't want to say a little bit more excited about it. I love this knife. Again, it's kind of a user for me. Something that I can, be a little bit more, that might look better in photographs and stuff, because I do like those dressier knives. But yeah, thanks so much, guys, for watching. I really appreciate it. Definitely go check out Keith's work. He's really nice. He's a really cool dude. He's obviously continuing to improve as each day passes. And yeah, he's a really great guy. So if you guys would like to see beautiful pictures of all of these lovely knives, you can do so by following me on Instagram at tovarishworks. If you'd like to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever, you can do so by reaching me at tovarishworks@gmail.com. And if, of course, you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Thanks so much, guys, and I will see you next time.